Today's video is the last video that I shall be doing over the course of my current journey to Germany. I wanted to say that I'm grateful to all of those of you who have been keeping faith with these programs and watching these programs despite the sometimes odd lighting conditions and sound issues that have obviously arisen whilst this trip has been underway. I should also say thank you to all of those people, including, by the way, first and foremost, my wife, who have supported me throughout my trip to Germany, even as I make these programs. As of my next program, I will be back in London. It'll be business as usual. Programs will no doubt get longer again, which some people may appreciate, perhaps others not. But anyway, we'll be back to normal, I should hope, on Friday, tomorrow, when, as I said, the next program is made. Now, to add one further point, as I'm travelling to London later today, this program is being made early in the day on Thursday. That inevitably means that I might not be fully up to date with all the news as it evolves during the day. It's possible that by the time you watch this program, all kinds of things will have happened which I was not able to cover in this program because of the early hour in which it was made. If so, all I can say is apologies, and obviously I will be catching up with the news later on Friday and will comment on any new thing, new to me, that is to say, which has happened over the course of today. Well, with that, let's now turn to the news itself and where we are. And we are, in fact, on the cusp of three potentially very important political developments which are going to affect the overall direction of the West. The first is the British election, which is taking place today. The British parliamentary election, called unexpectedly by Rishi Sunak, the Conservative Prime Minister, who, as of tomorrow, will almost certainly be the former Prime Minister. I don't think anybody seriously expects him to be re-elected. In fact, all the speculation is that we could be looking at the biggest landslide in modern British electoral history, certainly since Britain became a full democracy with every citizen having the right to vote. In fact, it's been suggested that this could be the biggest majority achieved by any government since 1832, in the period leading up to the Great Reform Act, which resulted in the first step that the British state took to extend the franchise, enabling people to vote for MPs to the British Parliament. So, potentially, in that respect, a historic day. As far as I am concerned, there are only two important questions about today's election in Britain. The first is how well or badly the Conservative Party does. Will it, in fact, do so badly that its future survival as a political force is cast into doubt? There is many opinion polls now which suggest that it could win fewer than 100 seats in the British Parliament, in which case that would be a cataclysmic outcome for the party, and we might start to see its prospects as a continuing political force in Britain recede. The other is how well the opposition parties on the left and the right, the opposition party on the right being Reform UK, the opposition party on the left being the so-called Workers' Party, put together by George Galloway, how well they do. I think by general consensus, the Workers' Party is unlikely to make a significant impact in this election. It was called long before it could organise properly. It doesn't have a national organisation. It might potentially win seats in one or two places. In Rochdale, where its leader, George Galloway, is standing for re-election after his breakthrough by-election victory just a few weeks ago. And, well, there may be one or two other places like Blackburn, where the former British ambassador Craig Murray, well-known commentator, and by the way, somebody I know reasonably well, where he's standing. But by general consensus, this election has come too early for the Workers' Party, which was, of course, one of the reasons why it was called when it was. On the right, however, there is a much more formidable and well-organised political force, which is Reform UK, in effect led by Nigel Farage. And this party has been the target of systematic attacks over the last few weeks, ever since Nigel Farage rejoined the campaign. And it will be very interesting to see how well this particular party does and whether it has a viable chance of replacing the Conservatives as the future main party on the right. As for the big underlying question about what the Labour government, the future Labour government of Britain, will do, as far as I'm concerned, it will be more of the same. All the indications are that Prime Minister Starmer, as he will be as of tomorrow, intends no great change or break from the policies that Rishi Sunak's Conservative government has followed ever since the ousting of the previous Conservative Prime Minister, Liz Truss, and just a few weeks before of her predecessor, Boris Johnson. So Rishi Sunak brought the Conservatives back to the mainstream, and we've had what might be called a mainstream establishment government in Britain ever since. And when Prime Minister Sunak is invited by the King to form the next government, well, we will get, I predict, more of the same. Now, the other election which is going to take place is not happening tomorrow, but it's happening on Sunday, and that is the second round of the French elections. Now, the French have a very complicated electoral system, and I have gradually come to realise that I misunderstood the form of the second round. I assumed that in the second round of the election, it would be a contest between the first and second placed person in each individual constituency after the first round, an outcome which would have heavily benefited Marine Le Pen's party, the Rassemblement National. However, it is not actually like that. It turns out that any candidate for parliamentary seat in the French Parliamentary Assembly elections who wins 12.5% of the vote in any one constituency has the right to campaign and to seek election to Parliament in the second round. And that obviously expands the number of candidates who are able to stand for the second round to a far greater degree than I had imagined. And it also opens the way for significantly more manipulation of the electoral process than I had expected and than I had realised. So what it means what that means in practical terms is that though the united left parties, the so-called Popular Front, led in theory by the veteran leftist political leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is most unlikely to win a majority in the French parliamentary elections. Mélenchon and the others are advising their candidates who have done less well in the various constituencies to pull out and to lend their votes to President Macron's centrist party, Ensemble. But, as one might have expected, Macron's party is not returning the favour to the same extent. So we could have a situation where in many constituencies the leftist candidate pulls out, instructs his or her supporters to vote for Macron's party, but in other constituencies where it is in fact Macron's party that is still in third place, they will continue to campaign and might not lend their support to the leftist candidates. And that might mean that we might end up with a bigger support, a bigger bloc of Macronist, centrist MPs than the results of the first round might lead us to expect. I have to say, I find this a strange decision on the part of the left. I would have thought that by now they would have realised that lending their support to Macron's party without getting at least identical commitments is a fool's game. But anyway, that is what they have done. All of this is being justified by the supposed need to keep Le Pen's party, the Rassemblement National, from winning a majority in the French Parliament. And it may very well succeed. This sort of gang up against the Rassemblement National, despite the fact that it is certain to emerge as the biggest party, is going to create a chaotic situation in which there is no single political force able to dominate the French National Assembly, which is, of course, the outcome that I suspect President Macron now wants. And presumably what he will then do is he will appoint a so-called technocratic government and challenge the parties in the French National Assembly either to support it or to oppose it on every individual vote. It is a recipe for political chaos and uncertainty at a time when France yearns a change of direction, and one which all but guarantees that the problems in France will pile up. As I said in my penultimate programme, President Macron's entire strategy now seems to be to try to create chaos and uncertainty in France in order to try to maintain his position, whereas in reality it's now absolutely clear that the great majority of French people have rejected his policies and have rejected him. So the outcome in France is looking bad from every conceivable point of view, and one which, in which miscalculations, both by Macron and by the left, seem to be guaranteeing a prolonged and intensifying political crisis at the very same time when the French economy could also be hitting a major fiscal and perhaps deeper economic crisis as well. But if the other big place where the election is now very much in a tailspin and where we may have an outcome very soon is the United States. Now, two things have happened over the last week, the course of the last week, which may between them have held the Biden campaign below the waterline. The first was President Biden's disastrous performance in his television debate with Donald Trump. The second is a decision of the Supreme Court of the United States to confirm that the president has immunity for official decisions that he takes within his capacity as President of the United States. Now, the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States ought, in my opinion, to be largely uncontroversial. It merely codifies what has been the consistent practice throughout US history. And if one reads the Federalist Papers, which hardly anybody does anymore, and looks at the discussions and debates that took place when the Constitution was drafted, I would argue that the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States is fully consistent with the intention of the founders. They always understood that the president, as president of the United States, would have to take certain decisions which would be controversial and which might open him up personally to legal challenge, and they didn't want that to happen. And though they didn't specifically grant him immunity, they created, in place of the process of criminal prosecutions, the mechanism of impeachment, which it is clear to me was always intended to replace it where the president himself was concerned. And the mechanism of impeachment recognizes the decisions of the president are both legal and political at one and the same time. So the founders created a mechanism that combines both legal and political aspects by transferring any prosecution of the president for actions that he undertakes from the courts to the Senate, where the president is tried for high crimes and misdemeanors, and where he can be convicted by a jury of senators, but the jury only has to find him guilty by a 2/3 majority for him to be, in effect, impeached, convicted of impeachment, whereas in most criminal cases in the federal courts in the United States, I understand that juries are expected to deliver unanimous verdicts. So that, to my mind, is all I'm going to say about this decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. Some people don't like it. Some people believe that it sets the president above the law. I don't see that at all, given, as I said, that the impeachment mechanism exists, and given that any one of his actions can be challenged through the process of judicial review in the courts and can be set aside by the courts, as very often happens in the United States. But I'm not going to go further into this issue. Suffice to say that the only reason why we've had judgments like that at all, a judgment like this at all, from the Supreme Court of the United States, is because over the last couple of months, roughly a year in fact, a succession of cases have been brought against the president's opponent, Donald Trump, by the Justice Department and also by prosecutors in the states of Georgia and New York, which, in my opinion, have, without exception, been either misconceived or frivolous as well as misconceived. In other words, Trump has been the target of what to me look like openly political prosecutions. And I think this has forced the Supreme Court to basically clarify the law without fundamentally changing it. And of course, if people don't like that, well, they should have thought more carefully about bringing the kind of cases that they have done. But anyway, the effect of the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States is that it is now going to be extremely unlikely that President Trump is going to be prosecuted for any substantive case, and that even some of the sentences in the two cases in New York are going to be deferred until either just before the election or perhaps possibly even after the election. And given that there seems to have been a misplaced hope that these court proceedings would suffice by themselves to knock Donald Trump out of contention, the fact that the Supreme Court has now made that decision, which in effect makes that impossible, leaves President Biden faced with his opponent, an opponent who comprehensively bested him in the television debate. So the question then becomes, will Joe Biden continue to stand for the presidency? Now, the pendulum has swung backwards and forwards on this question ever since the television debate. And I get the impression that more and more Democrats, especially following the Supreme Court decision, have now come to the conclusion that there is no real effective option if the Democrats are to have any chance of holding on to the White House or even making a strong showing in the congressional elections that happen alongside the presidential ones. Anyway, I think more and more Democrats have come to the conclusion that the only way to deal with this situation is for the president to stand down. And I think also there's been a very grudging and reluctant consensus starting to emerge that at this very late stage in the electoral process, the only person who can replace the president himself as the Democratic Party's nominee in the presidential election in November is the Vice President, Kamala Harris. And my sense is that over the last 24 hours, there has been a concerted attempt to get the president to accept these realities and to decide to stand down. He had a meeting over the last couple of hours with Kamala Harris, and there's been apparently a letter put together, according to Bloomberg, by various so-called moderate members of the Democratic Party in Congress. And anyway, it all looks to me as if the pressure on the president to stand down is mounting. Now, whether he will resist it or whether he will accept it is something that I'm not able to say. As of the time of making of this program, he appears to be resisting it. After he met with Kamala Harris, he apparently had a video call with White House staffers in which he said apparently that he had no intention to stand down and that no one is pushing him aside. Well, often in my experience, people say these brave things right up to the moment when they do, in fact, decide to stand down. So if by the time you're watching this program, Joe Biden has indeed announced that he is no longer going to be the Democratic Party's candidate for re-election as President of the United States in November, I, for one, will not be surprised. Certainly, as I said, the pressure is building. If the president withstands it, I suspect the pressure will grow. I don't know what will happen if the president continues to resist. People have talked of various constitutional mechanisms, but it seems to me that with the president still determined to press on, the Democrats are going to be faced with certain very, very difficult choices. And I am not sure, I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand what the mechanisms that might be available to them actually are. One thing that has happened over the last 24 hours, which I doubt that it has helped the president at all, was his very strange decision, the very strange decision of his intimate team to apparently include his son, Hunter, in discussions about whether he should stay or go. I think, given that Hunter has just been convicted of an offence of unlawful firearms possession, and given his notoriety, I would have then thought that at this time, at least, keeping Hunter at a distance might have been politically the wise thing to do. But anyway, there we are. We're going to have to wait and see what happens. For the record, I think if Kamala Harris does replace the president as the Democratic Party's candidate for the for election as President of the United States in November, I think the Democrats' problems are going to simply get worse, even worse than they already are. But as Alex Christoforou and I said in discussions and programs that we did on the Duran, the Democrats have created this situation for themselves. I don't really see how they can find a way out of them easily. They left this problem fester, and it has now exploded in their faces. Well, all of this would be bad enough if these were peaceful and stable times. They are not. They are times of deep crisis. There are wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and a deteriorating situation with China in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. There is a possible festering debt crisis in the United States also. And the United States needs a president who is fully engaged and who is in a strong position to manage these problems. Certainly, the United States doesn't need a president who is distracted by his own apparent infirmities and who might be angry and disillusioned and embittered as he fights for his position, or if he has to accept that he is not going to be his party's nominee for the presidency, who might be deeply angry and resentful towards everyone else, everyone around him, because he feels that they forced him out. And of course, if they do force him out as candidate in November, they might decide that it's a mistake to keep him on as president at all, in which case, again, maybe the pressure will build for him to step down from the office of president as well. And then, of course, things are going to become even more complicated and even more dangerous still. But anyway, there we are. And all of this, even as the war in Ukraine appears to be heading for its climax, towards its climax. And I say this because yesterday I did a program in which I said that Ukraine had suffered what looked to me its worst day, at least since the Russian capture of the village of Ocheretino. But I also said that it was likely there would be other bad days immediately following. Well, we've just had another day, perhaps not quite as bad as the previous one, but pretty grim nonetheless. And, well, as I traditionally do, I'm going to now engage in a brief rundown of the military reports from the Ukrainian battlefields. So yesterday I said that the news had come through that the micro-district west of the aqueduct, east of the aqueduct in Chasiv Yar had finally been captured by the Russians, even as the Russians appear to be entrenching solidly on the northern flanks of Chasiv Yar and taking steps to launch an attack on Chasiv Yar from multiple directions, one which would eventually capture this strategically placed town that opens the way towards the biggest remaining city in Donbass still under Ukrainian control, which is of course Kramatorsk. Well, yesterday, as I said, Chasiv Yar was the big news. Today, it's Toretsk, just a few kilometers south, one of the most heavily fortified positions on the Ukrainian defense lines, fortified by the Ukrainians since 2014. A town, Toretsk, which looked all but impregnable, at least to frontal attacks, until just a few weeks ago. There were reports that the Russians, instead of launching a headlong attack on Toretsk, would be looking to outflank Ukrainian positions in Toretsk by advancing south from Klesheyevka, this village that the Russians recently recaptured close to Bakhmut, and advancing north from Ocheretino and Arkhangelskoye and Kalinovka, villages either captured by the Russians or in the process of being captured by the Russians in the Avdiivka sector, that the Russians would carry out some great pincer movement to trap the Ukrainian forces in Toretsk. Well, it turns out it's been an awful lot easier for the Russians than that, because they have launched a frontal attack on Toretsk, and to everybody's astonishment and incredulity, they broke through the first defense line, and their advance ever deeper into Toretsk is continuing, into the Toretsk, I should say, conurbation is continuing, and in fact, if anything, it seems to be accelerating. One gets the sense that Ukrainian resistance in this whole area of the town of Toretsk is crumbling at an astonishing speed. So a couple of days ago, we got the report from the Russian Defense Ministry, confirmation that the village of Shumi, which is one of the villages that makes up the Toretsk conurbation, and which was right on the front lines, had been captured by the Russians. Then we got reports that a landfill and a coal mine, major fortified positions created by the Ukrainians, had also been captured by the Russians. Then yesterday we got reports that the Russians have broken into the village of New York and captured around half of that village. And now we're getting further reports that further north in Toretsk, in the Toretsk conurbation, the Russians have made further dramatic advances pushing deeper inside this conurbation. And there are apparently photographs and films of Russian soldiers advancing in places far deeper, far further west within the Toretsk conurbation than anybody had expected that they would be at this time. And perhaps the most alarming development of all is, for the Ukrainians, is that these Russian troops seem to be pushing through these supposedly impregnable fortified lines without encountering much in the way of Ukrainian resistance. Now, a couple of days ago, a week ago, the Russian newspaper Redovka said that the fundamental problem that the Ukrainians face in Toretsk is that because it's been a quiet sector of the battlefronts ever since the Russians launched the special military operation back in February 2022, and because it seemed to be so strongly defended with such powerful fortifications, the Ukrainians have been quietly, whenever there's been a problem anywhere on the front lines, they've been quietly withdrawing units from the Toretsk sector, this quiet sector as they believed it to be, and redeploying them to other places where it looked as if the Russians might be achieving, or on the brink of achieving, significant breakthroughs. And it looks as if not only has that process been happening, but the tipping point was the Russian offensive in Kharkiv region. And Kharkiv region, and by the way also in Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians took the decision that in Kharkiv region the Russians were pushing forward and might soon be threatening Kharkiv itself. They also became concerned that the Russians seemed to be moving fast towards Chasiv Yar. They were at that time attacking the micro-district west of the aqueduct, east of the aqueduct. That the situation in Chasiv Yar was deteriorating as well. And so over the last few weeks, the Ukrainian General Staff, General Syrsky, took the decision again to redeploy critically important forces from Toretsk to try to hold the line in these two places, in Chasiv Yar and in Kharkiv, and in the case of Kharkiv, perhaps to launch a counteroffensive to push the Russians back beyond the border, something that supposedly it was agreed should be done before the NATO summit meeting on the 9th of July. Well, the result is that Toretsk is not entirely empty of troops, but there are insufficient numbers of them, and the result is that the Russians have been able to break through deep into Toretsk, and we are looking at a collapse of Ukrainian defenses there. So that's perhaps the big story, as I said, over the last 24 hours. Chasiv Yar yesterday, Toretsk today. But of course, also Russian advances in other places as well. And I'm not going to revisit in detail the events that have taken place in perhaps the most critical area of all, the Avdiivka or Cheretino area. But over the last 24 hours, we've been starting to get reports that not only are Russian troops now a kilometre and a half distant from Progress, the village that forms the outermost fringe of the critically important Pokrovsk conurbation, one of Ukraine's major logistical hubs in Donbass. but that the Russians, now that Sokol and Novoselivka Persha and other places look like they're falling rapidly under Russian control, the Russians have now resumed the advance from Novo-Alexandrovka to Vozdvizhenka, preparing to cut the main supply road from Pokrovsk, running eastwards towards Konstantinovka and to Chasiv Yar. And allegedly, the Russians, as of yesterday, were within 400 meters of Vozdvizhenka. They've been bombing and shelling this village for some time. I've no idea how well organized the Ukrainian defense is in this particular village. My own sense is that the Ukrainians have perhaps overinvested in the defense of the other village, the village of Sokol, which they appear to have seen as the linchpin for their defenses in this area. And it could be that the defenses of Vozdvizhenka are not particularly strong. But one way or the other, the Russians are now within sniper and mortar distance of this relatively small village. And of course, if Vozdvizhenka falls, the road is in effect cut. There is no mechanism, there's no means whereby the Ukrainians can send supplies eastwards to their forces in Chasiv Yar and Konstantinovka using that particular road. To repeat again, point that I've made before, there are other workarounds. The Ukrainians can send supplies by other roads, but the roads apparently are not as good. And to the extent that supplies would have to be rerouted through Kramatorsk itself, any supplies being sent in that way would risk becoming overloaded. The supply routes would risk becoming overloaded, and that might complicate the supplies as well. So, major problems for the Ukrainians in the Avdiivka Ocheretino sector. And, well, the very latest reports from Krasnogorovka further confirm, as far as I can see, that the Ukrainians are gradually withdrawing from all their defense positions in Krasnogorovka, and that important town looks likely to be under full Russian control, maybe within the next few hours, at which point Ukrainian defenses in this area will have collapsed, and we will have a situation where the Russians are effectively camped outside two of Ukraine's most important logistical hubs, Pokrovsk and Selidovo, as well as Kurakhovo, with consequences for the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass that I find difficult to estimate. So anyway, a overall disastrous situation for Ukraine on its battlefronts. And I spoke yesterday about the fact that the Russians had launched airstrikes, or missile strikes, I should correctly say, on two frontline airfields, the one in Mirgorod and Poltava, how apparently as many as 9 fighter jets, allegedly 8 Sukhoi 27s and 1 MiG-29 were either damaged or destroyed in missile strikes on Mirgorod airfield or in the air. The attack on Poltava seems to have destroyed at least one Mi-24 helicopter gunship and engineering equipment that the Ukrainians had deployed on this airfield. And, well, within just a few hours, another airfield, this time located in the Krivoy Rog area, which, to be clear, is located on the west bank of the Dnieper, quite a long distance away from the front lines in Donbass. Anyway, this particular airfield has also apparently been attacked by the Russians using missiles, probably, again I suspect, Iskander air missiles. They would be within range if launched from Russian-controlled territory in Zaporozhye region, just saying. But anyway, and apparently on this airfield, Kryvyi Rog airfield, a number of Ukrainian Sukhoi 25 fighter bombers, rather I should say ground attack aircraft, were also damaged or destroyed. Now, the attack on the Kryvyi Rog airfield is probably connected to a Ukrainian drone attack on a substation providing electric power to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in Energodar. There's been a lot of speculation that the Ukrainians might be planning some kind of renewed offensive towards the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I'm not sure whether that is correct, by the way, but it is the case that there was a drone attack on this substation, and the Russians have been angrily complaining about this. But the attack on Kryvyi Rog is located on the other side of the Dnieper, fairly close to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It could be that the Russians struck at these fighter bombers because they were worried that Ukraine might use them in some kind of attack on this power station. But it really, in a sense, it hardly matters anymore what the Russian intentions actually are. The Russians have been conducting offensive operations right across the contact line ever since October 2023, when the Ukrainian offensive began to run down and the Russians began their operations for the eventual successful capture of Avdiivka. And these operations have ebbed and flowed ever since, but with every resumption, they seem to gain power and momentum. The Russian advances move further and faster than they had done previously, and the Ukrainian military, by contrast, seems ever less able to hold the Russians back, even as, the next wave of Russian advances comes. And, well, I haven't discussed the situation in Kharkiv region, but my sense is that the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk is probably in the process of being captured by the Russians also. Probably there'll be more information about that tomorrow, but General Syrski, who's apparently been sent to the area to try to see what the situation is like, I think he's most unlikely now to feel that an offensive in this area by the Ukrainians is possible. What I think he's more likely to do is try as best he can to cobble together some sort of defense. And anyway, a major crisis in Ukraine. And it's worth pointing out that all of this is happening whilst the President of the United States, most specifically, is in effect out of contention. It's uncertain who is making the decisions in the United States anymore, but quite apart, as I said, from his own personal issues, he has to be worried now, principally about the ongoing implosion of his political position within his own party. He must be asking himself, what can I do to shore my position up? And that must be the main priority, both of himself and of his team. I suspect that there are people in the National Security Council who are rushing to the White House, trying to get the people there to understand how bad the situation in Ukraine is becoming. But I wonder whether these people are able to get much attention from the decision makers, the key decision makers who matter. Perhaps they are, perhaps not. All of this, however, on immediately ahead of a NATO summit meeting due to take place in 5 days, which the President himself is due to attend. Meanwhile, other NATO countries left in a state of greater uncertainty. Chancellor Scholz of Germany has been making comments about the conflict. He has categorically ruled out sending German troops to fight in Ukraine. He said that, of course, on several occasions. But he's also said that he opposes a ceasefire, even though the situation on the front lines is going from bad to worse, as he perhaps probably does know. But he must know that if he comes out now and supports a ceasefire and does so before this is official US policy, he could find himself isolated, and he must have issues trying to find out who it is in Washington that he can speak with. Anyway, in the meantime, even as all of this is going on, the other side, the Russians in this case, are brimming with confidence. They are seeing their army advance relentlessly across Ukraine. And they're also getting favourable economic news. Now, we've just received further news about the overall economic situation, the GDP growth situation in Russia. And the Economics Ministry in Russia is now reporting that, according to our estimates, GDP in May 2024 was 4.5% above last year's level in annual terms, which is better than the 4.4% above the previous level in April 2023, reported in April. Now, this may not sound especially significant, but I would point out that we're now looking at a situation where one would expect the base effect to be starting to have an effect. To the best of our knowledge, growth in Russia began to take off in a big way last year in May and June. So at this point, one ought to start seeing GDP growth figures start to level off, simply because we're now comparing high growth figures this year with high growth figures last year, as opposed to high growth figures this year with lower growth figures last year. But it isn't turning out like that. Growth rates, GDP growth rates in Russia continue to be extremely high. And it's starting to look as if the Russian economy is again going to surpass its GDP targets this year. Now, there are concerns. There are still signs that the economy, in fact, there are continuing signs that the economy is overheating. Just as we ought to have been expecting GDP growth figures to start levelling off at this point, the same ought to have been happening with inflation, the inflation numbers. But inflation continues to run between 8.5% and 9% on an annualized basis, which suggests a very fast-growing economy indeed, in which conditions are tight and there are signs of overheating. something which must be causing, in fact is causing, concern to the central bank, which is anxious to bring inflation rates down again. And unsurprisingly, we've now had certain comments about this from Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank. And she says this, she's just reported to have said this: "We've recovered quickly, quicker than we expected ourselves, than expected by many. Growth rates were very high in 2023. Growth rates are very high now, and certainly everyone wants to keep them. However, it seems to me that it is important for us to comprehend the current situation and understand that this is a long-distance run. This is not a short run, but indeed a marathon distance, and furthermore across the country and with barriers. We therefore need to estimate forces and understand how we work with constraints. Mere crisis response measures and the use of reserves should not be the response to such permanent structural change of the economy. This is rethinking of priorities from my point of view and reallocation of resources." What she is in effect saying is that growth is too high, and that is feeding into higher inflation, which is going to create problems further down the line. I suspect that as growth consistently comes in faster than the central bank expected, leading to faster inflation than the central bank expected, that we're going to see tension increase again between the central bank and perhaps the finance ministry on the one side, and the economics ministry and the industry ministry on the other. The central bank and the finance ministry might want to rein growth in so as to bring inflation back to its 4% target, whereas the economics ministry and the industry ministry will be committed to keeping growth high. Well, there are rumours that the central bank intends to increase its base rate for interest rates up to 17% from the current 16%, that they might be prepared to raise interest rates further to 17% in July. All the previous increases in interest rates have so far failed to rein back growth, and the central bank might feel that it has no option but to do this. We shall see, but the point remains, growth in Russia remains extremely strong. It is not growth based upon some kind of military economy, as some people repeatedly say. If you want to talk about a war economy, look at Germany in the 1930s, on the eve of the Second World War, before a single shot had been fired in the Second World War. Military spending in Germany before the Second World War accounted for roughly a quarter of GDP. In Russia, it accounts for roughly 6% of GDP. In the United States, by the way, during the Second World War, military spending accounted for something like 40% of GDP. And in Germany, towards the end of the Second World War, it accounted for over 50% of GDP in 1943 and over 60% of GDP in 1944. 6% of GDP does not a war economy make. But we are looking at a very rapid increase in growth indeed. The economy, the Russian economy, is firing on all cylinders. And whilst that is, of course, increasing confidence, it also means signs of overheating and inflation. And the central bank would not be doing its job if it were not concerned about it. A fascinating studying contrasts between the United States and Russia at the present time. Go on, government arguing with itself preliminary before making what are probably going to be strong decisions, I suspect, over the next few weeks to bring the inflation process there under control. Another government which, frankly, looks completely adrift. One government winning the war it is fighting in Ukraine, the other completely unsure what it is doing, as the man who leads it looks distracted and out of control. Well, there we are. That's the situation as I see it today, as I return to London from Germany. Let me repeat again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms. This is where I end my program today. On our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things, including our Football 24 series. Lots of signs of that in Germany, by the way. So German people take a huge interest in football, even more than the British perhaps. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Next program in London. Have a very good day.